Thank you very much. I was delighted to get this invite, and once I'd accepted it, Georgina then told me that I was probably running into a bit of a cauldron, and that a lot of people would disagree with everything that I'm about to say because they think that economics should have nothing to do with this sort of thing. So I decided to add a subtitle, which was "The Highway to Hell." Is economics actually going to drag ecosystem services down? Let's find that out. So this comes from, I think the criticism of economics comes from a common misconception, and that is that true economists are actually not accountants. There's actually quite a few differences between us. Some of them are visual, just a few minor differences between them. Mainly it's to do with how they make you feel when they're in the room. They light up a room, I find. But there is a small technical difference as well, and that is that accountants are interested in prices and economists are interested in values. And this distinction really does matter. A very simple example, Riverside Walks, what's the price of them? It's zero, and that's the revenue that a private firm would get from providing them, and that's why they don't. But the value is very definitely larger than zero. So for all the people that are critics of economics and valuation, I want to see whether we can actually make decisions without values. Well, unfortunately, if you do that, you're going to come up against two inescapable truths, really. And the first is that human wants, including those with the highest possible moral motivations, exceed the resources available to satisfy them all. We've only got one world, and it's not getting any bigger. And because those wants are bigger than resources, then every time that we decide to do one thing, we are making a decision not to do another. We are implicitly placing values on each option. Valuation is utterly unavoidable. It's the essence of decision making, and to pretend otherwise is irresponsible. I think that you ought to be explicit about the valuations inherent in decision making, and that you should recognise the inevitable trade-offs which decisions imply. And those real-world trade-offs are indeed very complex, and that leads us into a very nice way of formulating them, which is nicely obscured by those lovely little logos at the top. The Ecosystem Service Framework, or the ES in ESPA. And it starts off by noting that the world is indeed a very complex place. There's a lot of processes going on, but that these deliver us services which, in a way, are the inputs that we get from natural capital. And these combine with inputs from other types of capital, such as manufactured goods and human ingenuity, that sort of stuff, to provide goods, the things that influence human well-being. And by goods, I don't just mean things that you can buy in shops. I also mean a whole variety of other goods that are not actually marketed. Indeed, it's a big complexity of different services and goods out there. But actually, it's this complexity which makes economics, I believe, the logical way of trying to make these decisions, because all of these goods come in a great array of natural units, and you can see there tons, gigawatts and column micrograms and all these sort of different things. Very difficult. Now, to all those detractors who don't share the true belief in economics, what I'm going to do now is give you what you really want. I'm going to put you in charge, and I'm going to ask how you would make decisions. But more than that, I'm going to give you everything you actually want. I'm going to allow you to make decisions about absolutely everything, not just the environment, but also about health services, transport, employment, social security. In fact, all the things that a real-world government decision maker does have to make choices across. And you can see that in this case, you're going to need to make that diversity of changes commensurate with each other. You need to know their relative importance. You need to know their value. Now, all I'm contending is that money is a convenient common unit to try and achieve this comparability. I don't think it's a great unit. I really don't. There's lots and lots of problems with it. And the only thing that makes it any good is that it's better than all the others. It is the least worst unit that I've come across. So what we're going to try and do is actually put all these things into common monetary units as much as possible. But although I'd love to be, I'm not actually as rabid as I probably sound. I do recognise there are some things that actually are very difficult to defend putting into money units. And so actually, I'm perfectly happy to admit there is a diversity of units that you're going to have to use. What I'm trying to do is get as many things as possible into a common unit. How do you decide between this column, this column? Well, as soon as these become non-robust, as soon as they become unreliable, then you've got to think about putting it in that other column. Once you've done this, you can take all these different goods and, as much as possible, try and work out the monetary costs and benefits of changes that are happening over here, combine them with this other information, and achieve some information on well-being to put to a decision maker. Now, to illustrate that, let's look at the complexity of effects that come from real-world projects, for example, converting forestry to farmland. Something which happens a lot, not so much in this country, but certainly in many other countries. And it's true that if you do that, you're going to get some nice monetised benefit here. But what you need to recognise is that there is a diversity of other effects that are being generated by this particular change up there. And all of these things need to be brought into the analysis. If you only look at the one at the top, then it's a completely flawed assessment. And this also allows you to look at other projects, for example, going the other way, something that might, fortunately, happen in this country, converting farmland into forestry. And yes, you'll get some immediate timber marketed benefits, but you'll get lots of other effects as well. And note that actually quite a lot of these are actually positive. Okay, so it does illustrate that we need to consider lots and lots of things, but how feasible is it to do all this? Well, these are the list of goods that were valued in the recent UK National Ecosystem Assessment. How did we come up with values for all these different goods? Well, some of them actually do have prices attached to them. Typically, you often have to adjust some of these prices because they'll be distorted, often by policymakers. For example, agricultural market prices are distorted by subsidies, but we can allow for that. We can adjust for them. Other things, we can look at values as reflected in their contribution to output. So if natural scientists can tell us about the relationship between pollinators and pollination, it's actually quite a trivial task to then take that change in output given to us by pollinators and turn that into a value. Other things, we can look at the value of avoided costs. So, for example, reed beds do a great job of cleaning up waterways, and therefore they mean that we don't have to invest in very expensive water treatment works. Some economists believe that you can value a huge range of things by just asking people how much you're willing to pay for them. I've undertaken lots and lots of these studies, I would say at least 40, maybe 50. And on the back of that experience, when we did the NEA, we hardly used this approach at all. And instead, we looked at value revealed in people's behaviour. By looking at what people do and how they spend their time, how they spend their money, you can actually infer values for many, many things. Now, this does leave us with a couple of limitations. One is that an important omission here is the existence value of biodiversity. I'm going to come on to that. And second, that economics really doesn't work well with regard to totals. Or rather, the value of totals, when you're looking at environmental goods, which are often vital to human continued existence, is infinite. And any value less than infinity is, as one economist said, a gross underestimate of that infinity. And therefore, economics should really be about changes, feasible changes. Therefore, in the NEA, what we looked at was 6 different scenarios for change and worked out values relative to the current baseline. That's a much more sensible thing to do. So, to undertake this analysis, you first of all have to do that systems modelling approach where you note there's many, many effects that come about through any particular impetus. So you can see all the effects that would arise from land use change. You have to recognise that there's many drivers of those changes. So market forces, environmental changes like climate change, policy change, and that all of those will have multiple effects and actually you can cascade it on and on, looking at incorporating all the complexity within your analyses. So let's look at an example. Land use change. How do we model each of the elements? We'll start off here with agriculture. You need a lot of data because agriculture is a very complex land use. It varies all over the country, so you're going to need lots of environmental data. Markets will have an effect, policy will have an effect. You need long-term and spatially disaggregated databases if you want to look at this. Now, Georgina insisted that I put up the models behind these, and I'm sure you can work them out pretty quickly. But basically, just to decode, I know she hates this, but basically land use is driven by human behaviour, but subject to a load of constraints, like things to do with the fact that I've got a farm that's got really rubbish soil, or it's a high temperature in summer, that sort of thing. This will dictate the potential yields that you can get, and all these put together will tell you what land use you should expect. Now, something that Ben said in the previous talk that I entirely agree with: don't trust any model that you can't validate. And you can do this because it's bringing you out with predictions of what the land use should look like. You can take those models, you can drop a bit of the data out, you can predict for the data that you've omitted and compare your predictions with what actually happened. And this is what we've got here. So this is the predicted land use for, in this case, cereals, and this is the actual. And as you can see, it actually fits pretty well. And you can do these for lots and lots of different land uses. If I put sort of standard fit statistics up there, they'd look incredible. But actually, your eye is a better judge of how good these models actually fit. So they fit pretty well. Because we know they fit well, and they've fitted for a long period of time, we can reassemble the data, re-estimate the models, and now begin to test what would happen if things change. Normally, policymakers want to know about what happens if I change policy. We could do that, but more interesting is what would happen if climates were to change, which of course they will. And so these are predictions from UK SIP, and you can see that rainfall reducing in the growing season and temperatures increasing. What's this going to do? Well, it's going to mean that activities in places like here, the borders of England and Wales, which at the moment you can't really do very well, not very profitably, like growing cereals and oilseed rape, will become more feasible in those areas, and they will displace the sort of activities that you've got at the moment, like dairying. Now, of course, from a farming point of view, that's pretty good because you get more money for this than for this. And so if this is the distribution of incomes at the moment, just what you'd expect, high down here, really low up here, middling in Wales, then actually when we look at, say, here, which is just a projection into the future really, under fairly similar conditions in terms of policy, most of the country goes green, which means gains. So climate change, which is going to be globally a really, really bad thing, will actually be quite good if you're a British farmer. Doesn't mean, of course, it'll be good if you're a British consumer because we rely so much on imports. What happens if you take that and then you change policy? So we've still got the climate change when we go here, but now we put in a more stringent set of measures with regard to protecting the environment. We actually rule out certain activities, particularly in areas of high environmental value. Well, you can see that it reduces the amount of profit that farmers can make in those affected areas. And of course, if you were a farmer or if you only cared about the market, you'd say this was better than this. So we need to get rid of all these environmental regulations according to this simple result. But the world is not that simple. There are those other effects. Let's look at some of those effects. Every time land use changes, it changes water quality because land use is a major driver of water quality. Here you can see water quality in different months of the year according to different land uses. Here's what you get if you've got grassland, very little nutrient leaching into the soil, into the waterways. But remember in the previous maps we were looking at big increases of things like oilseed rape, big yellow bar up there. So we're going to get increased amounts of nutrients going into waterways. And that's not going to be good for ecological status. So we can link from there to the ecological status, taking into account the physical conditions and differences of different rivers. What's the values associated with this? Well, there's actually quite a few values associated with it. One is, for example, it's going to change the cost of treating water. It might have feedback effects on agriculture. One that's perhaps more interesting to try and think about is the effect that it's going to have on recreation, because it'll illustrate one of those methods. How do we come up with values for non-market goods like recreation? So you can do this first of all by collecting some data, look at a very diverse area with good quality water and bad quality water, with high population and low population, rich people, poor people. Go to their houses and ask them, well, we know where they live, ask them simple questions like, where do you go? And how often do you go there? And that's it. You don't ask them any crazy questions about how much you're willing to pay for cleaner water or that sort of stuff. You can then link that to data on travel times to these different sites and on the water quality at these different sites, all of which you can obtain from objective measures. Now you've got all the information that you need to examine the trade-off between the costs of visits, the number of visits that are made, and the quality of sites. And what we find is that as the costs increase, so the visits fall, which is what you'd expect. As the quality increases, so the visits rise. And people are prepared to incur higher costs to visit better quality sites. In other words, we can see people's value for improving water quality. That value is the value that we get from their behaviour. It's the only value that you can really defend. If it was higher, then you'd be putting too much resources into protecting watercourses. If it was low, then you wouldn't be putting enough. You can do this for the whole of Britain because there's fantastic data across Britain. You can find out where people go and the value of those visits. You can then say what happens to that value under different scenarios. So here's the scenario that we had before where farm intensity goes up, and for example, no government would ever propose to actually allow development on greenbelt land, of course. But if they did, then it would incur very large losses around cities. If instead we protect the environment, we actually see big green gains in these areas. And you can link in other effects that this land use change will have. For example, upon greenhouse gases, you can look at the storage in crops and trees, what happens to that carbon when you start felling and cropping, impacts on soils, impacts from machinery, impacts from these ladies, and you can bring them all together and see that in this high intensity world you actually see increasing emissions, here you see reductions. Now we can begin to bring all this together. This is the same result as we started off with, just looking at the market values of intensification or reducing intensification. And if we just look at the market values, then this is clearly the best option. In fact, this one actually delivers a loss. So surely that must be the right thing to do. But if we bring in all these other values, ones we were talking about like greenhouse gases, recreation and so on, we now find actually that intensification causes a loss in value overall, whereas this de-intensified scenario actually causes a gain. So you've got an approach here which actually captures a lot of the complexity that we're concerned about and actually conveys it in a way which decision makers can understand. There's a couple of issues though with this. For example, even within this apparently good world down here, you've got some areas where there are losses compared to up here some areas where there are gains. Furthermore, notice that this item I haven't monetised. Why? Because I don't believe the values that you get when you ask people how much are you willing to pay for the birds. So instead we've quantified it, but we haven't turned it into money. How can I bring that into my analysis? Well, I want to look at both of those, the targeting and the biodiversity together. And to do this, I'm going to look at all 6 of the scenarios that we looked at in the NEA, and I'm going to look at those values under 3 different possible objectives. And the first is, let's go back to that initial objective of just maximising farm values. Okay, I'm going to ignore everything else, but this time I'm going to use different policies in different areas. I'm going to target those policies. Here's the policies, here's where each one of them maximises value. You can see this NS policy works best in lots of the lowland areas. This WM1 works well in terms of maximising farm values in the highlands. What does that give you when you look at all the values together? So not just the farm values, but also the greenhouse gas values, the recreation and so on. Well, actually, by targeting, we can find some areas which actually give us gains, these green values. But there's a lot of areas where we're still getting losses. And you can see, especially around some of the cities, we're getting losses because actually the value that we're getting from extra agricultural use of these areas is much less than the loss in, say, recreation. Up here, a lot of the loss is because if you farm some of these areas, you're going to emit a lot of greenhouse gases. What happens if we now change our objective, and instead of maximising just the market values, we also jointly maximise with the non-market values? Do we still use the same policies? Absolutely not. In almost every area, the policy that you would adopt if you only paid attention to the market is not the policy that you would adopt if you looked at both market and non-market values. What would that do to total values down here? Would it improve them? It improves them massively, hugely. This is £19 billion per annum. That's about 6 times the annual budget that we spend on DEFRA, for example. So big gains even from just targeting policy. But all of this is done using values. What about that last column that I said where we can't actually produce reliable values, and bringing in biodiversity? What if we bring this in through a simple route, just saying, right, any policy which in an area reduces the amount of biodiversity in that area, we're going to rule that out of play. Okay, so we're not going to allow any policy which in an area causes biodiversity declines. How is that going to change our choice of policies? Well, actually, it doesn't change it that much. In other words, there's a lot of areas where this gives you the right policy. But you can see there are some areas, including that area we highlighted before, where we actually rule some policies out of play. By imposing a constraint, we must come out with a lower value here because we're stopping some activities. How much does it cost us to do this? Well, actually, there is a decline, but you can see that in relative terms, it's really quite small. And compared to the massive gains that you get by targeting, we're still very well ahead of the game. Okay, that's half the story. That's the S part. What about the PA bit? Proper economics, not accountancy, recognises that a pound given to a poor person may generate greater increases in well-being than a pound given to a rich person. And there's some really famous results showing this. This is coming from the original Easterlin type work, which basically shows that if you look at life satisfaction and you compare it with income, it's not a straight line. It's initially, there's a very good positive relation, but once you get up to a certain level of income, then it begins to tail off quite dramatically. Now, what you might not be aware of, this is actually embedded in the standard Treasury cost-benefit rules. It's not used very often, but it is there. You could do it. You can utility weight for this phenomenon. Oh, you know that word there. Okay, this is obviously very important when we consider goods which are of particular value to poorer communities. For example, as you can tell, a lot of my stuff's in the UK, open access resources such as urban parks. If we go back to the NEA, 6 scenarios across here, this is the impact in terms of gains and losses from the baseline, valued in pounds per household, of the 6 scenarios. And you can see some of them deliver gains, some of them deliver losses. This one pretty bad. And that's what you'd get if you did a standard cost-benefit analysis. What now if you weighted a pound given to or taken away from a poor person more than a pound given to or taken away from a rich person? Not surprisingly, because this good, urban parks, is predominantly used by poorer populations, it increases the value of gains or losses. Okay, so you can incorporate a measure which tells you about the real underlying well-being impact of different changes within your cost-benefit analysis. Who pays, who benefits, and by how much? What we've just seen there is an example of where taxpayers were funding a scheme and a particular section of society enjoyed the benefits. There's lots of other examples, countryside stewardship, again taxpayers, and then it's more dispersed across society. But ones that I find particularly interesting are ones where you've got the private sector paying. Here's an example from the River Foy down in Cornwall, where the water company funds the scheme, and the water company, farmers and society all benefit. To illustrate this example, here it is. There's the Foy down in Cornwall, actually provides water for most of Cornwall. Pesticide use by farmers in this catchment means that treatment costs are very high. Now, what we did was we designed, we used game theory to design something where we find out how much really are farmers prepared to pay to stop using this pesticide. And it should be, if you can get to it properly, it should be very much related to the amount of profit they're going to lose. What you absolutely don't want to do is go to farmers and say, how much compensation do you want? Because you will not get an answer that bears any resemblance to their underlying costs. I just realised this was taped. Oh well, I'm told. But if you set up a competitive bidding process where the farmers think, oh, there's no point me overstating here because they could take water from other subcatchments in the area, then you get a more realistic estimate of compensation costs. And what you find is that they are less than the treatment costs. In fact, the cost of taking pesticides out of water is very, very much higher than the extra profit that the use of that pesticide gave to the farmer, which isn't at all surprising. There's a net gain for the water company. There's also a net gain for the farmers because obviously they only give bids which still give them some extra profit. And of course, there's lots of gains to society. If you're somebody who fishes in this river, or you walk alongside it, or you're one of the businesses down in Fowey that actually benefit from the fact that they say it's a fantastic place to come visit, then you're all going to gain from this. Okay, so we've got that. Last one I want to talk about, conservation grain palm oil. This is one that we did in Sumatra. You know better than me what the problems are there. You've got these fantastic animals that are basically being driven out of existence by, in particular, palm oil. We were lucky enough to work with some farmers in the area. And this is a particular concession that we got data from. Wonderful data, absolutely amazing. Tells you about what's happening in each area of the concession. You can relate it to the physical environment. You end up with huge data sets. You can calculate economic measures like the opportunity cost of going into conservation. This is basically the loss that the farmers would have to endure if that land was taken out of production and put into conservation. And you can see it's not even across the place. It's particularly high near to processing plants because the costs are very low there, so the profits are very high. gather a lot of data about where animals actually can be observed. The sort of animals we're looking at include a lot of red list species. And you can take the concession and using the model data, you can turn that into predictions of the response from these red list species of putting different areas into conservation. And again, you can see it's not flat. There's no point converting areas right in the middle of very intensive plantation, whereas there's lots of points in converting places that are right next to primary forest. Now, if you like, this tells you about the benefits of conservation, and over here you've got the costs. These benefits are not expressed in money terms because we don't believe that we know what the what the value of a species actually is, but they're still quantified and you can compare it to the cost. And when you do, what you're getting is a cost-effectiveness analysis of where's best to conserve. And these really dark areas are areas which satisfy two criteria. They're very effective in terms of the number of species that they would generate, and they're very low in terms of the cost that they would incur to the producer. So these are the best areas. Will these areas actually provide the sort of costs which can be covered by now being able to say that your palm oil fits in the conservation grade criteria that now exists actually in large areas of Southeast Asia. We know the uptick in prices that people are prepared to pay for conservation grade. What does it do to profits? What we find is that actually for areas of, well, modest areas of conversion into conservation, a producer can actually improve his profits by undertaking these schemes. It's always going to be the case that the best thing you can do is convert 1 hectare of your plantation into conservation and claim that it's a conservation plantation. And increasing the amount of conservation that you have always has a negative effect on your profit because you're knocking out better and better parts of your plantation. Therefore, what has been introduced are minimum conservation areas. Okay, you can't join the conservation scheme unless you put in a decent amount of land. And these amounts of land here are actually quite substantial in terms of the number of species that they can preserve. Okay, summary. Natural science is highly compatible with economic analysis. Most of what I've shown you today is actually natural science analysis, not economics. But in each case, we've taken economics and used it to convey the value of the services that are being generated, and also to show to decision makers the importance of the natural resources that are underpinning people's well-being. Big policy impact. So the NEA generated useful inputs into several white papers and has helped bring about engagement with the business sector, Treasury, and actually researchers. Many, but not all, ecosystem services can now be valued, and those that can't, I'm arguing, can be incorporated nevertheless within economic analyses. We can efficiently target limited resources, which is very important in the times of austerity that we've got. Is it better than the alternatives? Well, here's Stewie saying, so how's that not valuing the environment working out for you? Because that's basically what we've had for the last 200 years and doesn't seem to be working as far as I'm concerned. What are the research challenges for the future? There are major challenges that this lays out for the natural science community. We need to undertake systems modelling. We need to understand the science of extreme events. We need to understand thresholds, reversibility and irreversibility, resilience, and the sustenance of natural capital stocks. And economic analysis can highlight the value of all of that research and bring it into real-world decision-making. To illustrate that, if we just look at the resilience issue, so Here we've got a simple diagram. Here's a stock level here, and as we move across here, there's more and more pressure on that stock. And what you can imagine, first of all, is a very simple stock where more pressure you put in, there's a nice linear response, the sort of thing that Ben has pointed out very rarely happens, and it's lovely and reversible, absolutely great. It's more likely that you get non-linear systems where there's some sort of threshold after which there's a different rate of decline, usually an accelerated one. But again, here I've still made it reversible. Sometimes you get these hysteretic reversibilities where you get depletion, and then in order to make it reverse, you have to massively increase the amount of depletion before the system begins to recover. And of course, some systems, you go past the threshold, they fall down, and that's it. They don't reverse at all. And all of these will have different economics associated with them. So if we think about something called the marginal resilience value, the value of each unit in terms of its ability to sustain the stock. If you have something like this, then you can virtually say that there's a constant value associated with using that stock, and there's nothing special about any point of depletion up or down this curve. Of course, that isn't true once you've got a threshold. As soon as you have a stock with a threshold and you start to get towards this, then this marginal resilience value will begin to curve upwards as you head towards that threshold, and will become very, very steep before you actually completely deplete the the resource. The more hysteretic it is, the steeper that curve. And of course, if you've got something which, once you go past the threshold, that's it in effect, then you'll get something which goes very, very vertical very fast, and in effect says you should not be using any of this resource beyond this point. Notice that I've started everything from about here. That's sort of reflecting whatever amount of risk aversion we feel is acceptable within society, but it might not be that. It might be that we actually want to be more risk averse, and you can see that you can capture that within the economics as well. There's a lot of natural science, however, in here, which at the moment I would say is not really available, and we need to actually put resources into addressing that. So just to finish off, of course, it's not just about natural sciences and economics. There's an awful lot of other social science research that needs doing. We need to understand the imports and exports of virtual ecosystem services. We need to turn all this into decision rules. We need to engage with the business sector. We need to understand public attitudes and social thresholds, because actually a lot of thresholds are not actually to do with natural science. They're to do with what we feel is acceptable. And of course, we need to understand the co-delivery of ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. So, in summary, natural science and economics are perfect partners for ecosystem service management. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ian. You got through that. You've got plenty of time to spare. You could have had another.
That's fantastic. Georgina made me put about 8 slides in just before lunch.
Yeah, well, plenty of time.
Yes, she was right.
Okay, so now we've got 20 minutes for questions. Okay, yeah, well, I'll take a few actually, just so that you remember them.
I'll write them
down. Okay.
I was wondering if the and sorry if you covered this in the talk. I was wondering if the impact on markets was taken into account when looking at, say, for example, the profitability of doing conservation, so that if you say change a lot, really reduce the intensity of farming, you, for example, probably end up put up the price of food. Whether that those sorts of issues and feedbacks are taken into account in the analysis of the profitability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's it.
Hi, thanks. I'm Tim Daw from University of East Anglia and Stockholm Resilience Centre. My question relates to the marginal utility of income that you spoke about, that there's a stage between the valuation of the good in your earlier slide and its conversion to, or how it implies well-being, and that's how that good is actually distributed amongst society. And you did refer to that, but in relation to that, how much, given that you use market prices a lot to value the goods, how much do market prices actually indicate the value to well-being? So in the system we work on, if somebody takes a fish out of the sea, which is quite a lot of nutritional value, that has a very, very low value. Whereas if someone takes a sea cucumber out of the sea, because a wealthy person wants to eat that, even though it has low nutritional value and perhaps of less interest from a poverty alleviation perspective, it has a much higher market value. And if you've got time as well, about the need to validate models, I would say in our system that we've been working on, we totally cannot validate our models because we don't have the data, and we've been ambitious in the scope of our model to actually model the things that are actually there in the real world. But absolutely, we do not have access to data sets that allow us to do sophisticated modeling. We've done a best guess of what the system looks like according to the stakeholders.
I'll take one more, Simon, while you think about that, and then get the interrupt answer.
I was just wondering about how you factor in time. Basically, if you increase your agricultural yield, the impacts and the benefit of that will be instant or almost instant, whereas the negative effects of, for example, the carbon loss won't be visible for hundreds and hundreds of years. You'll be committed to it, but the people that actually will lose out are not people that are even maybe alive today.
You want to have a go at those?
Yeah. Okay. Those are really good questions. Although I'm not just saying that to be nice. I mean, they're difficult questions. So first of all, impacts on markets and other goods. So two things I want to say with regard to that. One, probably not the point that you were saying, but with regard to the Sumatran thing, a lot of people have said, oh, but hold on, this is going to push up prices. There is this kind of nice aspect of competitive markets, that what happens is if you find enough producers producing things in a way which actually makes more profit than something else, then other producers are induced into it. And in the end, what you should find is, like with dolphin-friendly tuna, it's very difficult in the end to sell your dolphin-unfriendly tuna, because there's loads of people that are selling it, without killing dolphins. And so there's a very nice virtuous circle round it. There's also a long-term effect that that competitive pressure actually pushes the price back down again. So that's kind of nice. But I think that you were probably more looking at the fact that if you use land for recreation, forestry, and that sort of stuff, then you can't grow food on it. Yeah, and you're absolutely right that is a logical consequence of what we've done. What you can, of course, do is that there are two responses to that. The sort of classic economic response, you just say, well, it's not a problem. We just import more. Okay. Now, there is some defence of that, actually, because every country should actually do whatever it is that it does best. So the logical consequence of we've got to produce all our own food is that we start to become self-sufficient in pineapples, and that's ridiculous. Okay, so we should do whatever it is that we're good at, and there is a good argument to say that actually is long-term the way to go. But I think it's perfectly reasonable, particularly as we go towards a more uncertain future, to say, well, actually, we want to preserve quite a substantial amount of ability to ramp up production in the future if we wish to. And there's no problem with, just like with the biodiversity constraint, putting on a food production constraint if society and its decision makers wants to do so. Technically, it's not a problem. There is a very deep issue about what does society actually want us to do, and I don't know how to answer. Economists absolutely. No, I completely agree. The economists can't answer that, and any economist that tries to, you shouldn't really listen to, because they're this whole stuff, this whole cost-benefit analysis, is not the decision, and a lot of people assume that that's what we're saying. We are not saying that. We are saying this is an input, an informational input into the decision process. The decision makers take that information and they make the decision. And they should have a good reason for ignoring what we say. They should have, efficiency is important. But nonetheless, if they have got a good reason, that's fine. Okay, Tim. Value of well-being. Can't really remember what the point was with the value of well-being. You need to incorporate. Then I went on to your second point.
Yeah.
No, of course not. Oh, absolutely not. No, I mean no, and that's why you have to adjust. I mean, otherwise, you don't have to adjust. If they did, we could just use market prices. It'd be great, but they don't, and that's why you have to adjust. Now, the second, you can't. Yeah. Okay, I am a bit extreme on this one. I must admit, I am rather suspicious of Popper. And Popper basically says, if you've got a hypothesis that cannot be tested and disproved, then that's not a hypothesis. So I'm probably a bit on that wing, I'm afraid. What I found is that people say that a lot, but actually, and they say, oh, these systems, they're non-linear. Oh, it's really difficult. Yeah, it is difficult. But actually, if you really put your mind to it, at very worst, what you will do is identify data gaps, information gaps, which you then have to address. I sympathise with the situation where there is no data. But I must admit, I don't understand how you can ever say anything with no data at all. It seems to me that you must use some data, even for your best guess models. Yeah, okay. This is a perennial problem. What do you do about things that happen at different points in the time? Now, a lot of people say, oh, economists discount. That's disgusting. Well, we don't. You do. You discount. You make decisions every day, and I bet I'm sure you're a lovely guy, but I'm sure you made some decisions today which have imposed some costs onto the future. So if you clean up your act, we'll change our discount rates. That's that, really.
Okay.
It just reflects preferences and behaviour.
I'm going to go to Ben first for the next question and then move this way. So, yeah, Ben. Microphone.
One's more of a technical question, I guess, and the other is perhaps more of a philosophical question. Technical question is, you seem to assume that all of your consumers are perfectly rational. And clearly, we know many people aren't. Obviously, yourself excluded.
That's correct.
So, what would be the impact of bringing in boundedly rational actors into your models? Would you be able to have the same level of precision that you do right now? What do you think about that as a general issue within these models? Second, in relation to the title of your presentation, which I liked a lot, I think we can rephrase the old proverb: "The road to hell is paved with good valuations."
No, bad valuation. Yes.
But less facetiously, what do you think are the risks of this approach? Because there are a lot of people that talk about the risks, and I'm sure there are people here that felt certain things as you were making the presentation, as you're no doubt aware. But what would be your appraisal be of the risks of taking this kind of approach?
Yeah. Take a couple more questions because they converge, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I've been working for a long time in Africa and in Kenya in spatial planning and spatial informatics, almost 25 years. I think I really noticed a change in attitude. In the 1990s, it was just capacity building and just doing the work yourself. At the moment, there's a very real interest in government, I think, just doing the kind of things which we are presenting for the UK. And it's basically what in Kenya is happening, moving away from a sectoral approach to say we need to plan across sectors, agriculture, water, and all these other things. And that's what you do very neatly in just bundling these ecosystem services, valuing all of them. So I think there's there's really a need there. Also forward-looking, moving away from 5-year planning, which was the case in Kenya. They're looking at 2030 right now and beyond. So it's a much longer time horizon they're looking at. So I was thinking that a very relevant question is how replicable are your approaches, which you develop over here to support the developing world? And then looking at the kind of knowledge and information which is available. It's a knowledge intensive approach. I think a number of African countries, as you may be aware, signed a Gaborone declaration earlier this year. It's to account for ecosystem services at national level in the financial economic accounting. It doesn't have the forward-looking approach and the scenario building approach. So I'd like to share that with you and just to have your opinion. What could we do to support these processes?
Okay. One more here, a quick one, sorry, and then you've got 5.
That sort of memory.
I think it was me actually. Hi Ian. I just wanted to push you to philosophise a little bit, because I know you said that these sort of outcomes they're not policy, they're suggestions in a way, but it does seem to suggest that a sort of aggregating approach, if you like, a utilitarian approach, that the sort of the rising tide will lift all is what's wanted. Whereas with the PA, with the poverty alleviation, what we often find is the rising tide doesn't lift all. So we're not looking at sort of overall aggregate growth, if you like. We're interested in the sort of safeguards and how we protect the few. So I'd just be interested to hear your comment on how you sort of square those things.
Yeah. Okay, so if I start off with Ben, actually, before I got into this stuff, founded Rationality was what I was really into, and it was great. I used to be totally ivory tower, and I loved it. And you could just show all these apparently crazy things that people did, and all these things that defied very standard, straight down the line Hicksian economics. And in doing it, I did it for more than 10 years, and it's absolutely lovely, and you can get people to do some really weird things in the lab. But I began to realise that actually nobody was being irrational. They had their own rationality. I would say that in 10 years of doing experiments, I don't think I ever met anybody who was irrational. They just had their own way of or deconstructing the situation that they were in, given the information that they got, and within those bounds, they did the thing that they thought was rational. Now, what you have to do is ensure that whatever models you're doing recognise or try to get through to the rationality of the person actually on the ground, and that's often complex. But even within these large-scale models, you can find things that look at first glance like they're irrational, but when you dig deeper, they're not. And the example that's coming to mind right now is, say, with that farming model, what we found was that relative to market force changes, so a price would go up and farmers would respond like that. You know, the next growing season, they would respond. Policies would change, and we'd find there'd be a real lag with response. Why would that happen? And then you think, oh, of course, it's because the EU has generated this fantastic data set for us by perpetually changing its mind with regard to policy. And farmers are just taking that into account. So the amount of subsidy you can get for something goes up, and the farmer says, well, we'll see. We'll see how that pans out. So I think that's something that you have to always build your models around. With regard to the risks of this approach, I think the best thing is to be honest. And that's why we don't put in values for birds, because they're out there. If you look in the literature, there's loads of people who've gone up to people and said, how much are you willing to pay for the birds? And they get numbers, but you really don't want to pay much attention to them. Jan, I'm very obliged for very kind things that you said. Thank you very much. I don't have huge experience of developing countries. I've only really worked in two, Sumatra, as you've seen, and Tanzania. And what we did do in Tanzania, it was part of the Eastern Art project there, and we had a go, and we found that actually there was quite a lot of data on ecosystem services in the area, in particular things to do with charcoal, to do with wild bushmeat, that sort of stuff, water. Actually, water was actually one of the poorest recorded, but we still got some information. I do feel, and it's great to hear that they're pushing the boundaries and thinking a bit more in a systems and long-term approach. I do think that the methodology is replicable. I think it does flag up that you need information, but I think whatever system you want to analyze to make decisions with, if you're trying to make decisions without information, that's a very high risk undertaking. So I do think that this actually does flag up the need to build capacity in different countries, and that includes data as well. Georgina and I actually attempted to get funding to rerun all of this in an African country, and we were superbly unsuccessful in getting that.
We got terrible referee comments, yeah.
Yes, that's always the way. Bloody referees. It was a great idea, wasn't it?
Brilliant idea.
Yes, it was. And hey, Adrian, yeah, I totally agree. I've always felt that if you wait for things to trickle through, you're going to be waiting a very long time. I think that what is happening with things like the deliberate utility weighting of the flows that come out to certain groups is an explicit recognition that the top-down, trickle-down thing, well, there's an awful lot of hands in the way of that before it gets down to the bottom. And it's better to explicitly acknowledge that.